So this morning, the topic of today is actually Jewish attitudes or Jewish laws regarding, and the way Hartman rephrased it is bystanders. When I was a very young rabbi, so 30 years ago, there was a case, I want to say it was in Las Vegas, where a woman was raped in a bathroom at a casino. And there were people that came in and out of the bathroom while this was happening, heard her screaming and crying, and walked out. And some of those people were caught, like on, leaving on camera. And there was a questions legally, were they responsible in some way for having witnessed a crime and not reporting it? And in American law, you are not liable to report a crime, right? If you witness a crime, it does not in any way make you liable for calling 911. If calling 911, certainly trying to stop it, which might be understandably dangerous, for reporting it. In spite of, if you remember the final Seinfeld episode, where they all end up in jail for witnessing a crime and like laughing about it and not reporting it, that is actually not my understanding in American law that actually could happen. Jewish law has a very different attitude to what it means to be a bystander. Now, I am not, I couldn't find anything that told me about Israeli law. Israeli law does not always follow Jewish law. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. It would be actually a fascinating question that I have to admit, I didn't do a major research project on this, but it would be very interesting to find out if Israeli law has different requirements for when you witness a crime than American law does. And as I said, I don't know. And sometimes Israeli law follows different type of, it follows British civil law for Ottoman law. It does, so I don't know if there's a difference. But in Judaism, in Jewish law, which is obviously different than Israeli courts of law, in Jewish law, it is a crime to be a bystander. And this is not just in criminal cases, but you will see in the sources how that, sorry, my phone will stop ringing hopefully in a second, how that Torah law looks at the idea of what are our responsibilities towards other people? What are our responsibilities to the communities that we live in and the people that we live around? So let's look at some Jewish sources. So so this is not a criminal, right? This isn't what we're talking about right now is not a criminal case. This is just what could happen in a society and happened regarding lost objects. So there is a lot of Jewish law, a surprising amount of Jewish law, more than you would possibly ever think. The Talmud spends a tremendous amount of time talking about lost objects. And what is your responsibility if you find a lost object? I'm going to stop sharing just for a second because this is the one that we're going to look at is lost animals. But there are other types of lost objects that one could lose, and people lose. My husband and his glasses lose all the time. And so the question becomes, what happens if you live in a society where people are obligated to take care of one another and you lose something? What is the responsibility of the person that finds it? What do we say in what is the nursery? I don't know if it's a nursery rhyme that we say about people that find things.
Finders, keepers, losers, weepers.
So nobody, that is not Jewish, right? That is so not Jewish. Finders, keepers, losers, weepers. As I said, there are chapters and chapters of the Talmud that talk about what happened if you find something. And so the question starts to break down in the Talmud about where do you find it and is it identifiable? And so they come up with all kinds of different categories. So if you lose something on Michigan Avenue and it is not identifiable, what are the chances that you're going to ever get this thing back? 0, right? So if, God forbid, you're walking down Michigan Avenue and you get to the end of the street and you reach your hand in your pocket and you realize that you had cash in your pocket and it fell out of your pocket, you retrace your steps, the money's gone. What, you may be very upset, but what do you know at that moment? Never going to find it again. It's gone. The rabbis call this state of mind Yeush. You've given up on it. And once a person has gone through Yeush, they've given up on it, finders keepers. So the interesting thing about lost objects in Judaism is not what's in the mind of the person. Well, it is sort of what's in the mind of the person that finds it, but it's really in the mind of the person that lost it. Would you assume if you picked up this $50, you look around, you don't see anybody, nobody seems to be looking at it. In theory, in Jewish law, you would think to yourself, well, the person that lost this has given up on it, therefore I get to keep it. So there's no losers, weepers here. It's this idea of, you know, they've given up on it. They know they're never going to find it, so it's mine. What if, however, you lose your wallet and it has ID in it? What do you think?
Different story.
Maybe, right? Like, okay, a lot of people are not nice, right? They may keep it anyways, but maybe. I had a cousin visiting me once in New York City, and she lost her purse on the street of New York City. And later that day, she got a phone call because somebody found it. It had her ID in it, and they called her and they returned it with everything in it, which was like in New York, right? Where you think this is never, ever going to happen in a million years. So you lose it and you go, oh, you know, maybe after you cancel all your credit cards, maybe like maybe somebody will return it. You find somebody's purse. You're a good citizen. You know that in Judaism, you have an obligation to return something that's identifiable. And you go, you know, maybe this person hasn't given up on it. And you are responsible then for returning it. But what if you found something and somehow you knew that it was lost, you know, 6 months ago or a long time ago, right? You could say, I bet this person has given up on it and therefore, you know. What if, however, you were at synagogue and you lost your beautiful bracelet that was worth a lot of money? You were wearing a very expensive bracelet at the synagogue. Unidentifiable. Of course, at our synagogue, we know everybody sits, but you lost your bracelet at synagogue. You get home, oh my God, like my bracelet, it's lost. What do you think? Do you expect you're going to get it back?
Mm-hmm.
Pretty good
Sure.
chance, right? Because you lost it in a private place where you feel confident that somebody is going to. So it's in something, you may lose something that's not identifiable, but depending on where you are, you might expect, you would have a fair expectation that you were going to get it back. So and the person that finds it is going to think, you know, my God, somebody lost this at synagogue. I'm sure I know who this person was. Even if, let's say, it was a big bar bat mitzvah, and you don't really know who the person was, but you know they were at the synagogue. So the assumption is, you know, somebody's not going to give up on this, and therefore I have a responsibility to return it. So these things are pretty, you know, easy because you're not really going to it's not a lot of trouble. Right? Most likely you find this very expensive bracelet on the seat of the synagogue. What do? You call Nancy. we had a lovely productive meeting last night. It looks like we're really gonna move forward with co-sponsoring a refugee family from Afghanistan, which I'm incredibly excited and proud. It looks like we're gonna move forward. Looks like we have the volunteer support. Looks like we have people that are willing to donate to make this happen. But the one thing I said at the meeting, like, last night is take on this volunteer responsibility. There has got to be a cadre of volunteers so that if it's your day to tutor or to bring groceries or to do whatever and you can't show up, that there are other volunteers on standby. Because what can't happen is, Nancy, I can't pick up the groceries. Can you send Brian out to deliver them? Like this can't be. But you find a bracelet, you turn it over to Brian, the office waits, somebody calls, not a hassle. Now we're going to look at a text in the Torah, which is a whole different story. Because in ancient times, you know what people lost fairly regularly?
Animals.
Animals, right? Animals, they broke through a fence, they wandered off, they jumped, whatever. People lost animals. And animals, by and large, were identifiable because if you owned an animal, it probably either was branded or it
It did
had
branding.
I'm sorry?
Identifying mark. Oh,
It had some sort of identifying mark of who it belonged to. So now the Torah is going to talk about that. If you shall see your fellow's ox or his sheep scattered and scattered, right? So it could be one animal, it could be many animals. What might you want to do? Oh my God, there's like 6 sheep. I'm on my way to work. I'm in a hurry. I'm supposed to meet somebody. I don't even like animals. This is a hassle. What am I supposed to do with these animals? I'll just look at the Torah, the word that the Torah uses, and hide yourself from them. You shall surely bring them back from to them. So if you look at the Hebrew, right? If you see the shore of, look at the Hebrew word, achicha, your brother, the Torah translates this as your fellow. When the Torah talks about your brother, unless it's like the Joseph stories, it almost never means your biological brother. Never means your biological brother, unless it's very specifically talking about a narrative about a family. When the Torah talks achicha, the reason that it's translated as your fellow is because it means your people, your community members, your neighbors, which is a very interesting, I don't know about you, I like my neighbors well enough, at least on one side, but I don't think of them as my brothers or my siblings. But in the type of society that the Torah is trying to create, that is the type of that's how you feel about the people that you live amongst. By the way, in the Israeli army, if anybody, I don't know if anybody would know this, but how are fellow soldiers most commonly referred? How do they refer to one another?
Brothers.
Brothers, ach. I mean, we have the phrase in Hebrew, right? Brothers in arms. But I don't know that in day-to-day life, other than maybe colloquial, if you call somebody bro, maybe it's used to a certain extent. But in the Israeli army, you refer to each other as brothers. It is the common language that's used, not only for people of equal rank, but also for the officers. So it's sort of kind of this breaking down of hierarchy. Interestingly enough, also in the book of Deuteronomy and the book of Devarim, when they talk about setting up a king, which the Torah is not that thrilled about, it says you shall take one of your brothers, right? So again, not your literal, like biological brother, But the idea that the ideal sort of society, though, some of us get along with other people better than we get along with our own siblings. So, don't think about those kinds of family dysfunction. But on the whole, for people that feel this sense of loyalty, familial loyalty, where you would do something more for a sibling than you would do for a neighbor or a stranger, the Torah is trying to break that down and create a community where it is your brother, it is your achicha. So therefore, the assumption is if you saw your literal biological brother's sheep running away, you would probably be more likely than if you saw like the neighbor 2 doors down. We'll stop that, right? Not in this society. So, and what aren't you supposed to do? You're not supposed to hitalamta, right? It actually literally means to disappear yourself, right? So of course to hide yourself, right? To like just look the other way, not see it, keep walking, keep your head down, don't notice, don't make yourself disappear in the situation. And then the emphasis in the Hebrew, hashev tashivem, you shall surely return it. Okay, so that's one level of a major hassle, right? I was on my way to do something else. I have to go. I have to catch these sheep. I have to I don't know, maybe I don't know how you lead sheep. I rope them, whatever, and take them to the person. So that's a hassle. But if you think that's a hassle, wait till this. If your fellow is not near you or you do not know them. So think about the level of that. Your achicha that you've yet to meet. You don't even know this person who's considered your ach, but if they live close enough somehow in your community, either they live far away or you don't even know this person. This is, Mr. Anonymous, well, not Mr. Anonymous, because there's a marking on it, but some guy who might live 10 farms over, you don't even know this guy, but here are his animals. What do? You shall bring it home to your house, and it shall be with you until your fellow seeks it, and then you shall bring it back to them. So you shall do with their donkey, so you shall do with their garment, so shall do with every lost object of your fellow, which they have lost and you have found, and then it repeats it. You may not hide yourself, right? You may not hide yourself. That is a law in the Torah. So a garment, okay, you find a cloak on the street, it's got the names. Maybe they just came back from camp, so their name is on the thing. It's embroidered, and so you know that it's somebody's garment. You may not even know them, but you take it home, you keep it until some point somebody comes and says, I think I heard you found my coat. But what happens if you take an animal home with you for days or weeks or longer? What do you have to do?
You have to feed them.
Right, you have to feed them. It's not a passive act, right? It's not a passive act to take somebody's animal. It's not cheap, right? It's one thing to say, I found their wallet and I'm going to give them a call and we'll meet at some rendezvous spot when it's both convenient and I'll give it back to them. That's a bit of a hassle. There's probably very few greater hassles than finding somebody's animal and you don't know who they are, or they live far away from you and you have to take this thing back and take care of it. And so the Torah sets sort of the highest level of standard of what it means to not just turn a blind eye, to not disappear yourself from the situation. Elise.
What we just read, it said you keep it until they seek it. What if they don't seek it right away? Does it become yours?
If they never come and get it, like it's an animal, right? And somebody never comes and gets it, at a certain point, I guess it's yours, right? It's yours.
No, I mean, if it's like 2 days, if it's 2 hours, is the responsibility as much on the person to seek it as it?
Well, this is where the crazy thing about Yeush comes in. It's really only yours if the other person has given up on ever finding it. And so the question is how long is that? for something that's, you know, identifiable with a great value, it could be a really long time. So the assumption is eventually they're going to come get it. Like this is, you know, eventually they're going to come get it, and you are responsible until they do, which is a huge. Oh, are women in the Israeli army also called brother? No, I'm sure they're called sister. I'm sure they're called sister. I've shared this before. When I first got to Israel, my first time I went, and I was in college, and so the resident assistant, frankly, it was hard. I was like homesick. It was a culture shock. I wouldn't know what the heck I went for a year. What did I get myself into? There were no cell phones. There was like no way to call home. And the resident assistant in the dorm, who was a couple years older, right, than Israeli students are a bit older than American students because they've been through the army. And she used to refer to us as banot, which means daughters. And I loved that. Like, I don't know in her mind that it meant what it meant in my mind, but there was something so familial and warm. Now, I don't know if you'd want somebody like your army commander calling you daughter, like that might seem patronizing and, you know, whatever. But but I don't really know. The answer is I don't know how Israeli female soldiers refer to one another. So we'll have to find that. We'll have to find that out if anybody doesn't, if anybody knows. Martha, do you know, or you just want to make
No, I was referring to we had a lot of acreage in southwestern Wisconsin, and we're riding our bikes one day, and this cow is coming out of the fenced-in pasture with 50 cows behind it. And we're trying to get it back, and I only had a candy bar. I mean, I'm a New York girl, and I'm trying to tempt it with a candy bar. And this cow comes over, but the cow got out, and then the other one started to rush the fence.
Oy.
In the meantime, the cow was crossing the road, and a truck came by, and I'm yelling, you know, what should we do? You know, do you know where the cow belongs? He goes, oh, no problem. The owner will come back. It'll come back. He was very nonplussed about the entire thing, and I'm worried about this poor cow getting stuck. So yes, animals are problematic.
Right, animals, you know, can.
And nobody was home. We're busy knocking at the door. That was
Right.
the problem.
Judy?
I think about the hardship of bringing an animal to your home. For some people, let's say you're not a farmer, you're a tailor in town. Where are you going to put these sheep? How are you going to feed them? And it's really a hardship for some people.
Yeah.
That happens with other animals. I have brought a dog home. The dog
Well, I told the story already, I
I've
think,
coaxed it in with food, and then slowly tried to find out. I, you know, found the collar, and I don't remember who I called, but I did call somewhere, and they were able to put me in touch with the owner of the dog. And I have done that. I've stopped my car. I pulled over along the side of the road and walked around and knocked on a few doors near places when I'm not at home with dogs.
I mean, this doesn't just happen with farm animals, right? Like many of us, I just saw somebody the other day, like there was a car stopped in the middle of the street in my neighborhood. I'm like, what are they doing? And I saw a couple of dogs like running around the car, and they were trying to get the dogs in the car. And I assume it was not their dogs, right? But somebody's dogs had gotten out and they didn't want to just leave them. And I'm like, this has real application in the real world. Jerry? You're still muted. There you go.
If I remember right, in my Talmud class, I believe you're supposed to put up a public notice if it's found in a public way to identify the lost object, which will help someone reclaim their property.
Right. Thank you. Because we remember that the Torah is always sort of the first level. There's a few verses. And I remember I told you there are chapters and chapters. So thank you about how, so then what? Like, okay, I've got this animal, like I'm feeding it. I don't, you know, if I'm a farmer, it's one thing. And if I'm a tailor, as Judy said, it's another thing. So you try to help the person know that you have this, that you have their lost animal. If you know who they are, you're supposed to go to them and bring the animal back to them. So, so the Torah sets an incredibly high level But the phrase lo hitalam, right? Do not hide yourself. Becomes sort of this mitzvah in the Torah, because there are many ways, right? There are many ways that human beings can turn a blind eye. If I don't see it, then I don't have to deal with it. And that's absolutely unacceptable in Jewish law. And then, just to take it even a little further. So in one case, it's your ach, right? It's your community member. It's somebody, that maybe you like them or you don't know them, so you don't know that you don't like them. But the book of Exodus tells us you actually have to go even further than that. If you encounter your enemy's ox or donkey wandering, you shall surely bring it back to your enemy. If you see the donkey of the person who hates you lying under your burden, you shall not leave without helping them. You shall surely release it with them. So it's an even higher thing, right? Like I hate you, you hate me. We hate each other. And nonetheless, I have an obligation to, if the animal is lost, and I think I've shared this with you before, I've shared this with some of you before, that I was embroiled with a boundary dispute with our new neighbor like 20 years ago. And in the middle of what was a very contentious with lawyers, and it was really, really icky, their dog wandered onto our property. And don't think for a moment, I didn't think about, well, if I didn't like, just let it keep wandering. It's not my problem. I can't stand these people. But instead, I was like, okay, this is what the Torah meant. Went and got the dog, put it in a safe area, called them and left them a message till they got the dog. And actually, I've always shared this, like, we actually settled the case very soon after that. And I think, who knows? Who knows? Maybe because they realized, like, it would be better to be good neighbors than to continue to argue about something so stupid. But in any case, so the Torah sets this standard of how we're supposed to act in the world. Now, I started by talking about, not being able to be a bystander to a crime. And frankly, the Torah doesn't really, it's really only much later in Talmudic literature. The Torah really doesn't discuss the idea of, I see a crime, I don't want to report it, this is the punishment for that. The Torah is not that specific. But it does talk about the case, about what should happen if somebody gets murdered in an open field. So if somebody gets murdered in a city, in some way, the whole town is sort of responsible. If you don't know who killed this person, somehow it's like the whole town is kind of considered responsible in some way for creating the kind of society that would allow such a horrible thing as a murder. But what happens if they get killed in an open field and nobody can really be responsible for them, right? It just happened, and there were no bystanders. Nobody could have heard this person cry out. There's actually this whole ritual for how you measure where this was and what town it was closest to, and the town that it was closest to has to do some sort of an animal sacrifice to atone for the sin of this murder. So the idea is like these things can't just happen or don't happen in a vacuum, right? It's either the society that you create that allows, which we're actually failing miserably at. This is an interesting fun fact about Israel, about those of us that live outside of Israel tend to think of Israel as a very dangerous place. And we think of Israel as a very dangerous place because we know that there is terrorism or there could be rocket fire. But what probably very few of us know, unless you know people that have raised teenagers in Israel, is that, well, just throw this out. What was a reasonable curfew if you were raising teenagers, or maybe, if you were raising teenagers, let's say they were, before well, I shouldn't say this because this thing with the driving and you can only drive for 5 minutes before you have to be home for curfew. which I thought made me crazy. But in any case, what's a reasonable curfew if you're not talking about the whole driving thing for a 16-year-old to come home? Anybody
Midnight,
have a-
1 a.m., midnight?
Midnight, I would say midnight. Norm is stricter. He says 10, midnight. You wanna know
Weekday or
what the cur-
weekend?
Let's say weekend or weekday, maybe a school night, maybe a little earlier. You want to know what the curfew is for Israeli kids on the weekend?
Before
There is
Sunday?
no curfew.
Really?
No curfew. Come home whenever. I have friends that are American that made Aliyah, and they were really strict because they made their like young teens come home by 3 a.m. And they were like, you are the only parents. And there's no actual, believe it or not, real worry in Israel, which I find, I can't wrap my mind around this, about how your kids get home. People don't really, teenagers don't really have access to cars. Where you walk late at night. If you're a young woman, I'm like, you let your teenage daughter come home alone at 5 a.m. Like, doesn't she have to, they're like, yeah. There is not the same sense in Israel. I know this probably sounds like, Rabbi, you cannot, this can't possibly be true. Like, you're just exaggerating. This can't possibly be true. Nobody's going to let their teenage daughter walk home alone in the middle of the night. And the answer is the expectation in Israel. It's not like nobody ever gets raped, but really on the whole, incidences of rape, incidences of murder that's not connected to the conflict really just don't happen in the same way in Israel that they happen here. There is much more of a sense, some of us grew up like this, that you live in a neighborhood where everybody's kind of looking out for each other, right? Like neighbors know neighbors, people are. And so the sense of living in a society where people are responsible for one another, where people are, you know, if you got into trouble, you'd go to the neighbor's house, the neighbor would. It's a society that's not, doesn't have the kind of random violence that we have. And they have other issues, but that doesn't happen to be one of them. And so people live in that society in a way that feels inconceivable to us. Just absolutely inconceivable to us. And in a way, like, I don't want to wax poetic because there are a lot of things in Israel that make me insane. There are other things about their society. If you get me on the right day, I can certainly rant and rave about. But the idea of what does it mean to create a society of people that sort of feel safe because people watch out for one another, or don't hurt each other. And that is aspirationally what the Torah is trying to create by this idea of saying, you can't, you know, make yourself invisible. If a crime happens, if somebody is murdered, on some level, the whole society is implicated for creating the type of society that either turns a blind eye or creates or allows this kind of violence to flourish. And I listen, I can't, I mean, I'm sure we're all, you know, waiting for this trial in Kenosha to see what happens. And I will say, for myself, you know, the story that was portrayed in the media and maybe the much more complicated story of how this all actually went down in the heat of the moment might be more complicated than any of us understood. But the one thing that seems to permeate all of this that I can't stop thinking about is if you create a society where people are allowed to show up in public places with guns, like it's the Wild West. Like, how did we get to shoot out at the OK Corral? And however you pick out who was actually guilty and who, you know, raised their gun first and who was shooting in self-defense, what kind of a society allows people to show up in the street with guns and shoot it out? The insanity of it, the insanity of like where we are and what we have come to is just, it's just inconceivable. It's just inconceivable. You know, So in any case, one more text, which
Brad,
again,
before we get off of that,
sure,
our society has changed a lot. When I grew up, which was in the 50s, so we're talking about 60 years ago, it was much closer to what you described, the current situation in Israel. I mean, when we were 12 years old, we would take our bikes and we'd go to the not to the neighbors, we'd go to people miles away to can so-and-so come out and play? We'd all go out, and at dinner time, our
No.
parents expected us home. And nobody really thought about anything. I mean, there were a couple of times when my mother was calling around, is he here? Is it, because he forgot to go home.
right,
But you really didn't get in trouble, and there was no expectation that there would be. And I think to some extent, that's maybe something against just our current society, the way in this country, we've just moved in the wrong direction in a lot of ways. But but we were very much the same way at that time.
right. No, I grew up like that too. I wasn't allowed to come home. I mean, I had to be home by dinner, if I was on my bike, I kind of had to be home at dark. I couldn't stay out till, my mother was like, you only get into trouble after midnight. There's no reason to ever be out later than that. The only bad things are going to happen. So it wasn't like we could do anything, but the idea that you went out on your bike, you didn't have a cell phone, nobody knew where you were, and somehow you were going to make your way home safely. And I asked myself this question a lot, because by the time Dan and I were raising kids, that culture was gone in the suburbs where we lived. And what I don't really know, especially in Highland Park, is, was it really more dangerous? Was it really, statistically more dangerous to let, there's more traffic, there are more cars. Are there really more people that are going to lure them with candy? And, did our society really change that much? Or did our fear level, drive some of the changes in society? And I don't know, I don't really know, I always felt that, I know it was a horrible thing when kids who had been drinking and driving got killed, and, and it was horrible, right? But did it really need the kind of response of, the lockdown that teenagers go through when they get their license in Illinois? I don't know. I sometimes think that the reaction was too severe. But probably the difference for the way a lot of us grew up is you knew all your neighbors. So there was a sense of people watching out for each other. Rosette?
Yeah, that's basically one of the things I was going to say, is that I never had a curfew. But there was one question that there was one responsibility I was given. If I'm going to be out late, I had to call home.
Right.
Wherever I was, I had to find a phone.
Right.
There were no cell phones,
Right.
and call home. But my mother knew all my friends.
Right.
She knew their parents. We were in big groups, and she knew that I would be safe.
Right.
With my own children, I never gave them a curfew either. And they did have to do the same thing. They had to call home. But I had much more fear because kids were drinking.
Yeah.
Kids, they were going to New Trier. There was drugs going around. I was much more nervous about, and I was glad curfews had been put in place then, because I didn't have to give her a curfew. There was a law that gave them a curfew. But times had changed, and really changed, because I don't remember the drugs in my group's generation, the drugs and the alcohol.
She's right. The fear is not from the strangers, it's from themselves.
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing, the drug, and probably, maybe that's why it started to change. Look, I don't know how, well, all right, I've talked enough. Let's see who else has their hand up. Marcia. But you're still muted. Marcia, you're muted.
Not that it excuses it, but we are in such a different situation. It's interesting that Israel can kind of still have that communal closeness, even if it experiences prejudice against different people. It's expressed in different ways, but the US is founded on a culture of individualism. This was not going to be bound, except for years and years and years. It was bound by certain understandings, certain rules, but there has been a successive breakdown of that. And then when you have that, you have the rising fear, and then you get into all of this protection stuff, which is justification. But, you know, if you are a society of individuals and an individualistic attitude, how are we past the breaking point where we can have responsibility to the larger society and to one another?
That is such an excellent point. You know, one of the sayings people, I don't hear people saying this so much anymore, but, you know, I can do whatever I want as long as I'm not hurting anybody else. That's not actually a Jewish value, right? There's no sense of I can do. It's exactly opposite. Here's a set of 613 laws. You can't actually ever do just what you want. I mean, it's a totally different way of looking at your responsibility in the world. Even though it says Deanna, I know it's Sharon.
Right, I couldn't get my computer to work. When I was in high school, I ushered for local musical theater during the summer season at an outdoor park. It was about 1.5 miles from our home. I had a very protected, sheltered childhood, and my parents thought nothing of letting me walk at 11:30 or 12 o'clock through the park and then the other 1/2 mile home. When my kids were growing up, because I had the experience one evening, I was bike riding home after dark, and all of a sudden a gang of kids on bikes approached me. And I hear one of them say, "Yikes, it's a mom." And they all left. By the time my kids were growing up, my concern was we had become a toxic society to our children. Our children were not safe, and it wasn't themselves and it wasn't their groups of friends, although there was plenty to worry about there. But there were people who were trying to hurt children, who specifically targeted children. And now with the internet, we see that over and over. I don't know how or why or when the toxicity started, but to me, it was totally a breakdown in our community, in our society.
Do you think, I think what the rabbi is saying is it overstated? Are we focusing more on the outsiders? Because yes, it is there, but do you think that it's more that or more of what?
That's why I really want to make clearly there were always people that were predators and were abusing children. It didn't, you know, but we didn't know about it, right? It was kept quiet. It was hushed
and we lived
up.
in a safe community.
Right. So it's not like none of these things existed. I have a hard time imagining in the 50s, young people weren't drinking, you know, like they probably had easier access to alcohol in those days. But but on the other hand, you know, maybe people weren't driving as much. It's hard. I think it's hard to know. But I do want to do one last text about, which isn't so much about being a bystander as much as like how you are supposed to position yourself in society. What, you know, there are different kinds of people and how you are supposed to think about other people around you. So it's how do you, you know, what is your attitude towards other people? So this is from Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot is traditionally translated as Ethics of the Fathers. We try to now call it Ethics of Our Ancestors, or as you see, they just didn't translate it at all. They just called it Mishnah Avot. But it is so it's a section of the Mishnah. So that's rabbinic literature that is about 200 of the Common Era, written about 200 in the Common Era. Unlike most of the rest of the Mishnah, which deals with law, Pirkei Avot is more ethics, right? How is somebody supposed to be or act in the world? So they say there are 4 moral orientations among people. One who says, what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours, right? That's an average person, right? Most people, you know, they understand the difference. I've got mine, you've got yours. You know, let's move on. That's how most people are. But some people, and they're called sodomites, which interesting, we would say sodomite. If we called somebody a sodomite, we would have a different definition of what a sodomite means. But Mishnah Avot is looking at what is a sodomite in the Torah itself, which is, they're bad on many, many levels. What's mine, oh, I'm sorry. Some say that saying what's mine and mine is yours and yours is actually a bad way to be, right? Some people say that's average. Some people say, no, that's actually evil to say what's mine and mine and what's yours is yours. So we'll talk about that in a minute. What's mine is yours and what's yours is mine. That's somebody that's ignorant, somebody that wants it all, which you'd think was actually a higher standard. What's mine is yours and what's yours is mine. That's a pious person, right? I'm willing to share. You keep yours, but I'm willing to share mine. What's mine and what's yours is mine. That's somebody that's wicked. So some people say what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. That's average. But some people say, no, that's pretty evil, actually. So we'll talk about why or why not that's evil. What's mine is yours and what's yours is mine. Well, that's ridiculous. Like, we're just doing, like, that doesn't make any sense. So that's just, you know, some, like, who would even say such a thing? What's mine is yours and what's yours is yours. So I'm willing to give you everything, right? That's a pious person. What's mine and what's yours is mine. That's horrible, right? Somebody who's wicked. So what do you think about that? Why do some people say what's mine is mine and yours is just the stance of an average person? And why would some people suggest that, no, that's pretty bad. That's a high E standard of that's evil. Marcia.
I think that it's a great separation. If everybody, it's the US, it's this individualism and there's no responsibility to one another. And it's just it's individuals moving around.
It's the
There's no
only one that's
responsibility.
debated, right? The
Yeah.
other ones, it's the only one that's debated. Is this, you know, it's very obvious that if you're the kind of person that, you know, obviously what's yours is yours, but I'm going to share as much of mine as I can. You know, that's a pretty high standard of piety. And you know, it's one thing to say I'm donating to tzedakah. It's another thing to say, you know, mostly in Judaism, there's no sense ever that you have to like give away everything that's yours and live. Like we think we talked about, like my son, like, why should I ever eat a candy bar? You know, if I could give that money to charity, like how could we ever live with any luxuries when people are. So Judaism by and large does not expect that level of sacrifice. It expects you to open your hand to the poor. It expects you to, you know, donate to tzedakah. It expects you to stretch yourself, but it doesn't expect you to like give away everything you have and to other people. So everything, but this idea of, you know, what's mine and mine and what yours is yours, like, is that a reasonable stance? Or is that somehow, you know, this rugged individualism that could lead us to a society that we really don't want? Norm?
I think it's somewhat situational. What's yours is yours, what's mine is mine. If someone's going after your property, I don't care. You know, you're my next door neighbor, whatever you have is yours, and if someone wants to steal stuff from you, then I'm not worried about that. It's not so much what's mine is mine and yours is yours, it's how you look at it in terms of the situation. You know, it is an average thing saying, you know, what's yours is yours. I'm not going to come into your yard and take your lawnmower. But if someone else wants to take your lawnmower, I should have some responsibility, and I'm aware of it. I should have some responsibility to try to either stop that person or call the police or whatever, rather than not caring. That I think that's, to me, is a difference where it gets between being an average and an evil.
Lois? Wait, you're muted though. You got to unmute.
I had never thought of it this way until this moment. But initially, when you said what's mine is mine and what yours is yours, makes a lot of sense because, you know, I have my life, you have your life, it's fine. We just won't bother each other. But if you take it too literally, what mine is mine and what yours is yours, then you can come to the conclusion that you don't have to be in a position to help anybody else. You know, so if mine is mine and yours is yours, it doesn't matter, you know, what your situation is, because what yours is yours and what my, you know, am I saying it right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Barbara.
It's a philosophy of good fences make good neighbors, but there are times when you should feel under obligation to take some affirmative action beyond just what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours, and to share.
I mean, it's an interesting thing because on its face level, if we just read it and said, this is this is average, people probably like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, that makes sense. Live and let live. Or, maybe I should, you have what you have and I have what I have, and I shouldn't, envy what you have and whatever. You could have sold it as a perfectly reasonable moral stance. But Judaism is never satisfied with what we would consider a perfectly there's a sense of indifference, right? There's a sense of, I'm not paying attention. I'm in my house, whatever, you're in your house or whatever. This isn't even necessarily about, you're in your house and you don't have enough to eat and I should know that. There's a certain sense of indifference, right? That's why when I said, like, I can do whatever I want as long as I'm not hurting anybody. Like, first of all, you're just not allowed to do whatever you want in Judaism. There's no real concept of that. Like, there are obligations, there are moral obligations that go beyond as long as I'm not hurting you. Like, that's okay as like a baseline. Like, we would hope that as a baseline that you're not hurting anybody. Like, I don't think Judaism said, like, you don't get like a gold star because your base level is you're not hurting other people. You are supposed to be constantly thinking about how you help other people, whether it's people that are in your neighborhood, whether it's people that need help because they don't have enough to eat. Maybe it's your neighbor because they lost their coat. This is a crazy coat story that happened in the synagogue. Some of you have heard me tell you this story before. This is like the craziest coat story I've ever heard. We had a big bar bat mitzvah. It was freezing out. The service is over and the family and friends are going to have their celebration outside the building, which I'm not that thrilled about to begin with, but those were in the old days where that was very common. And one of the guests, or maybe it was a congregant, their coat was missing. Their coat was missing and it was cold. And we didn't know what to do. And we kind of eventually tracked down the family at the party, the whatever. As it turned out, a woman, a guest at the party, couldn't find her coat. So she took somebody else's coat. So this is, besides we would probably consider this in Judaism, stealing. What's yours is mine, right? Like, if you think that this doesn't happen, like it even happened at a bar, like, what's yours is mine. I can't find mine. I don't want to be inconvenienced. I'll take yours. Like, but the basic stance in Judaism is it's never just like the bare minimum is not acceptable, right? Just letting people, it's not acceptable. We, what is it? The kosher hot dog, right? We are held to a higher standard. That is basically what Jewish ethics calls us to, a higher standard than the baseline. Bonnie, you haven't said anything yet, so I'll let you and then Nancy.
This conversation reminds me of a conversation we had either the first or second week of class, where we talked about obligations to different categories of people. You have a different obligation to your family, and then you have a different obligation to Jews versus non-Jews. So here it seems more generic, but if you pair it with that other teaching, it seems that you have a different responsibility. You don't have the same responsibility to everyone.
Right, but you have a responsibility to your community. Now, the presumption is that probably mostly everybody in your community in the Torah were Israelites, or later on were Jews, because that's more or less through most of society. Jews lived amongst Jews, though not solely, not in, you know, in the golden age of Spain, there was much more, you know, exchange between Jews and non-Jews. So, but by and large, your community most likely were majority other Jews. But you have an obligation to the society that you're trying to create. And to try to create a just and aspirational society means more than just, you know, what's yours is yours and what's mine is mine. Nancy? Wait, you're still, there you go.
To your point of society and to Marcia's point of individualism in the United States, we are living this right now with COVID, that nobody who, or not nobody, people who don't want to be vaccinated for other reasons than medical are only taking care of themselves. We live in a community. We don't live in the Northwoods of Wisconsin where there's nobody else. So I think you have to even look at this more literal or less literally and more like we have to take care of each other. And I just see that so horribly dysfunction in the United States right now. It's just, how can so many people not care about other people?
Right. And then I won't wear a mask, right? I won't get vaccinated and I won't wear a mask. And it is beyond, I mean, this has been really lovely. I've had a lot of one-on-one meetings with congregants, and I offer to you, if we haven't done it, I would love to do it. And this seems to be the overwhelming conversation that I have with almost everybody, is what's happening to our democracy and the future of our democracy, and what are with these people that won't get vaccinated. Like, it is, everybody is just stunned. Like, people just walk around stunned, and it is the ultimate expression of this idea of individualism. How dare you tell me, you know, what to do? How dare the government tell me what to do? And the rest of us walk around, though, you know. All right, wait, who else had their hand up? Harold.
Am I off? Yeah, I understand how what we're talking about is intended to build a society that makes a lot of sense. It's good. What I'm curious about, is there any guidance on the other side of the coin in terms of people benefiting from what we've discussed? So, for example, when the tailor or the farmer is feeding somebody else's animals, and eventually 5 days later, that person shows up and takes the animals back. Is there any guidance on that? Or when you found the dog and returned the dog, or acted to return the dog to your neighbor, is there any guidance on what the neighbor should have done or should do? Maybe
That's
what
a really interesting question that I'm not sure of the answer to. Like, I think there may be something, if you keep the animal long enough and you're feeding the animal, like if it's a sheep and it's time to get sheared, you get to keep the wool. You know, if it's a chicken, you get to keep the egg. Like, I think that there are some, but I don't think there's anything like, you know, and give a reward, like it's been 5 days and the dog.
No, you wouldn't want that. You wouldn't want a requirement to give a reward.
Give a reward.
That would be nuts.
But I do think, if I remember correctly, I do think if you keep the animal long enough, you're allowed to, you know, if it's a cow, when you milk it, you know, you get to drink the milk. Like, I think that there are, that you're allowed to do that. No? Jerry's
I don't
saying
think
no.
so. Only because,
Wait, you just muted yourself.
Sure, you're, there we go.
okay,
Wait,
No,
now
you're
you just
still-
muted yourself again.
okay,
Yes.
all right. I don't think you're allowed to do that because you're profiting from a object that is not yours. You really have to reimburse whatever you get from someone else's property to the owner, who would have lost the income because he's lost his animal.
Lost his animal. Yeah, I think I may be confusing it with when a husband controls his wife's property.
I don't know about that.
I think I'm confusing it with that. But, you know, the question is, if, you know, this isn't specifically going, So Marcia said, there's a reward from showing responsibility to others and the bonds of community. Look, I think that the Talmud doesn't make the assumption that you're going to like have this animal like for a year. And as I said, at a certain point, if the assumption is the person that lost it has given up that they're ever going to find it again, it actually becomes yours. Like at a certain point. And what the Talmud does do is I think it does set up like, you know, how long, at what point can you assume somebody's given up hope? Right? Because if you don't know the person that's lost it. And so, you know, there are different time frames for when that is, if it's identifiable, if it's not identifiable, if it was lost in public, if it was lost in private. So I think even what happens with an animal is at a certain point, the assumption is the owner is going to give up hope on ever finding it, and then it becomes yours. So I think what Jerry said, that until that point, which could be a long time, you are protecting their property, meaning even the produce of their property, right? It's 12:05, so let's just do a couple quick ones and then I need to get off. So Martha.
I worked for several years for Lutheran Social Services, and it was the time at which there was all the flooding along the Mississippi, and that's Lutheran territory. And the minister there and our neighboring farmer both had independently said something which is a good response to I think it was Barbara who was talking about how we feel about other people and their responses. Anyhow, both these people said, and it may be, well, that it's their religious belief. They said that there is a problem among Lutherans, that they recognize that their people did not regard other Lutherans in the area as either family members or an extension of the family. And that they thought that was that one of their goals had to be, it sounded very unchristian to me. And basically that what we are sensing and what we are seeing is something that they see all the time. We see it in stark contrast to how our beliefs are.
I mean, I do think there are other communities. Judaism is not the only community that fosters community. Like a church community fosters community. The other people foster community. I would say the difference with Judaism is we legislate it, right? We just don't like try to create a thing where we hope that people will feel, you know, this responsibility to other people. We like define it and legislate it and measure it and say, this is the definition of the obligation, right? And I don't know the answer to how long, at what point somebody's animal like becomes yours, but at some point it becomes yours. Like this doesn't go on forever. But there's very specific legislation about our responsibility to one another. So that's it for today. Everyone have a lovely week. I will see you all next week, hopefully. And as I said, I'm still extending like these one-on-one invitations. So if we haven't done it yet and you would like to, Nancy sent out the email again today. So the link to my email is right there. So, just let me know.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Well, all right, bye-bye.